on industrial policy. And I look forward to questions and a lively discussion. It's the after lunch session, so let's keep it lively. We're going to start off with a presentation from Tristan Reed. The World Bank 4 days ago, last week released a new report on industrial policy for development, which I think has some recommendations. It'd be interesting to see how the audience reacts to them. So Tristan, over to you.
Thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me just take you through some slides, and I think the point of this is just to frame the discussion, so it won't be very long. I think as a starting point, I think it's important to go back to the first report in this series of policy research reports that our report is published in, which was the East Asian Miracle, published in 1993. And at the time, there were two big debates ongoing. One is about the state versus the market. In that report, the bank emphasized the role of market, or really macroeconomic fundamentals, in explaining East Asian growth, human capital, savings, and macro stability, both budget deficits and inflation. But critics, I think most notably Alice Amsden, argued that there was sort of a much stronger role for the state and in particular industrial policy. And that debate was sort of unresolved, or that in the bank it was resolved in favor of the market. There's a separate issue which is about replicability. So even regardless of whether you're doing the market fundamentals approach or the industrial policy approach, there was this view that Lewis Preston, the president of the World Bank, expressed in the foreword, which said that East Asia had this unique culture, politics, and history, and those may have been preconditions for success in either approach. And so there was a view that whatever happened in East Asia, it was a miracle and perhaps difficult to replicate. So we're providing a fresh perspective on some of these questions. This is the report. So my co-author is Ana Margarita Fernandez in the research department. It's out. You can get it online. Washington Post was very critical of it today. And I want to make 2 points. One is that, so this was a request from the board, specifically from the developing countries. Second, there was really no guidance as to what the message or conclusion should be. I think no one, there was no strong view. And Anna and I, we're research economists, and really took it, from a point of just looking at what the evidence has come since the first report, and making an assessment. I'll say, in terms of a high-level message, I think my friend who's a country economist, Suleiman Coulibaly, said, all the bank economists have these red cards that they throw into conversations. So a country asks us, do you want to do industrial policy? They say, oh, you can't pick winners, and it shuts the conversation down. I think what we're trying to get to with this report is that we want to continue the conversation and say, okay, you have this idea, let's experiment with it and see if it works. So let me take you through a bit of the report. So just definitions, there are many definitions of industrial policy out there. They have a lot of commonalities in the report. This is the one we use. Industrial policy is action to grow a strategic business activity. Industrial does not necessarily mean manufacturing. It can be agribusiness, mining, services, whatever you want. Business activity can include, both a product but also a task. So you can think of design rather than assembly, or adoption of a particular technology. And then strategic, all that means is that you've just decided for, some reason, for perhaps your development, that an activity is more important than another. So to start, we did a survey of our country economists, the people who are sort of the lead representatives of the bank to finance ministries last year, and 80% of them had been asked about industrial policy by their clients. And we also asked them what were the reasons or the motivation. And what we found was overwhelmingly sort of 75% of those conversations were just motivated by economic development in general. So the idea of creating jobs and investment, to a lesser extent, kind of specific issues of domestic competitiveness, like a theory of substituting for imports or expanding exports. But really very few of these clients are talking about the motivations that get a lot of play in the United States and the European Union: national security, climate change. So I think you heard a lot of narrative in the past year that industrial policy is about, quote, new goals. For the World Bank client countries, it is certainly about the original goal, which is development. So another thing you may have seen from the literature is this claim that industrial policy is mostly concentrated in high-income countries. This is a claim in a paper by Rekha Juhas and Nathan Lane and co-authors based on the Global Trade Alert. I want to show you 3 pieces of data suggest that's not the case. Global Trade Alert has some issues in terms of over-representing rich countries, but here's some other data. So the first is that in the report, we read the national development plans of 138 countries. And with the aid of a brilliant research assistant and not very much AI, we counted the number of industries that were targeted or mentioned in there. And what you see is there's this strong negative relationship. So poorer countries are targeting more sectors. One way to think about that is that they're not prioritizing enough. But the other way to think about it is that they're interested in diversification. And so the smaller countries with fewer capabilities have more to gain. And you see in the high-income countries, they tend to target, frontier technologies like AI or quantum computing rather than something specific like, cassava milling. The second point is to look at tariffs. So this is, of course, a classic, way to do industrial policy, protect the local market. On the left panel A, you see that the average, these are value-weighted, tariffs are higher in low-income countries, so there's some protection of markets there. Now, you might say that this is just for reasons of revenue. They haven't developed corporate or VAT tax sources. So to sort of test that objection, we look on panel B at the standard deviation of the tariff rate across products within a country averaged. And there you see that there's actually the most variation in middle-income countries. So that's, again, consistent with sort of asymmetric treatment of different industries and potential protection. Finally, we look at business subsidies. So we measure these in 2 ways. One is from sort of IMF and World Bank data complemented on subsidies paid to private businesses. And then we add to that data from the Global Tax Expenditure Database, which is sort of measures foregone revenue. On the left panel, you see that those are actually highest on record as a share of GDP in upper middle income countries. In high income countries, they peaked during the pandemic, but have fallen since. And you see the levels on the right-hand side. In upper middle income countries, actually the bulk of that is tax expenditure. I think one interesting thing to point out is that the IMF has an estimate that China spends about 4% of GDP on subsidies. According to these data, it's about average for a middle income country. So now we get into the meat of the report. So we go through 15 different industrial policy tools. I'll tell you a little bit about them. In the report, there's a kind of detailed summary of the research and also practical guidance for doing each one of them, if you so choose. 3 categories. So the first is public inputs. So these are things you might not think of as industrial policy, and are sometimes given to all firms in the market, but can be tailored in certain cases to the needs of a particular industry, and in practice often are. And these address specific market failures, which is that goods that are underprovided by the market. So if you have a coordination problem, having an industrial park is a way to solve that. If there's underinvestment in training by firms, skills development is another. Market access assistance, quality infrastructure are another. Then we get to the market incentives. So these are microeconomic incentives to change relative prices for particular industries, probably what you think of classically as market failure, industrial policies. The distinction we make here is between what we call first choice and second choice policies. So first choice policies are ones that directly address a particular market failure. So in the public goods case, you're addressing the coordination failure by having everyone locate in a park. Production subsidies and also specific innovation subsidies, which give you, say you want everybody to adopt a fertilizer, you subsidize that thing, those directly address the problem. The rest of the policies are second choice in the sense that they address the market failures indirectly by intervening in adjacent markets. So the classic example of this is a tariff, right? So you rather than subsidizing a firm directly that you want to promote, you put a tariff into the output market, and that addresses that provides a subsidy, but it also incurs additional costs. So quantitatively, we don't know how big these costs are, but as a heuristic, you'd like to be focusing on the first choice policies. The third category we consider are what you can call macroeconomic interventions. So two of these, one is a just competitive exchange rate devaluation. Another is a research and development tax credit that is kind of general and doesn't target a specific intervention. This latter one is second choice in the sense that it can be, it's just not very well targeted. It can be captured by large firms that would have done the R&D anyway. One caveat I'll just say, so we review the evidence on each one of these. Most of the evidence is about effectiveness rather than efficiency. So papers will say, hey, we subsidized an industry and it grew, but surprisingly, even in the economics journals, there's very little cost-benefit analysis. That's hard to do, but one heuristic way to do that is to say, how much money did I spend and how much tax revenue did I gain? And I think we need to see more of that in the literature. 5 minutes? Okay, great. Let me tell you, so I mentioned this debate about replicability. Lou Preston says it's all, culture in East Asia. I think we identify 3 country characteristics that make these different industrial policies feasible, and we argue that on average, to an approximation, in many countries, all 3 of these have improved. And so for that reason, industrial policy should be more replicable than in the past. So the first is about government, what we call government bandwidth. It's not the same as capacity, but it's actually the ability to interact with many firms at once and sort of get information from them. We see this both in the sense that there's, with the decline of military governments, there's actually more higher education levels in government. But also there are many more of these independent agencies that have mandates to directly interact with the private sector. We have people from investment promotion agencies here today. Local government cluster initiatives are other examples. Often these agencies have separate pay scales from the civil service also, which makes them more able to attract meritocratically. Second, local market size is also larger in countries, so that gives firms a better ability to scale in domestic markets. That can be one due to the growth in middle classes in countries with more equality, but also through sort of regional and preferential trade agreements that expand the local markets or outside of the domestic market, but nearby. And then finally, perhaps this most simple is fiscal space. So, in some countries, in particular as they move between income groups, tax revenue to GDP has increased. This is obviously not in all countries, but also, there's opportunities to create fiscal space by reallocating, subsidies to more productive uses. Okay, so this is the main table of the report, which says, there's a typology of countries based on these 3 characteristics, so government bandwidth, local market size, and fiscal space, and then that's going to point to a set of feasible policies. I'll take you through them, the ditto marks. So underneath each one is a ditto mark, which says that it applies to all the ones below it. The cell, it's a hard table to make. But and then the bold ones are the sort of first choice policies. The italics are the second choice policies. And so if you start, with a, say, low income country, no market size, no fiscal space, no government capacity, what do you have? Well, you can do industrial parks. You don't need to spend a lot on them. You can just have the zoning. You can rent out or sell off the land and make it back pretty quickly. You don't need to sink all the money that Ethiopia did into them. Commodity export bans, which raise the price of a good locally. You can do that very easily just through the customs administration. And then a competitive exchange rate devaluation. You only need capacity within the central bank. Once you gain government bandwidth, then you can do a set of what we might call more advanced public inputs, so skills development, market access assistance, which is like a export or investment promotion agency, and then quality infrastructure. Again, these are tailored to the needs of specific industries. Once you get local market size, the sort of protective policies kick in. So at import tariff, right, which is using the local market, local content requirements, and then tech transfer, quid pro quo. And then finally, when you get fiscal space, you get the full set, and that's where the productive sort of the subsidies kick in. And so I think one thing you should see here is that as countries develop, they will have more and more capability, but there's also an inequality, which is that the rich countries have the most ability to do the first best, or at least the subsidies, but not necessarily the public inputs. Okay, and so just to give you a note about this is the export promotion and investment agencies. We see a lot of growth over them over time. So we emphasize that there's a whole chapter on institutions, and we emphasize what these agencies can do alongside others like national development banks. I want to just say something because this is a green. So what we were talking about first was just diversification in general, trying to get new industries. What if you have more narrow goals? So jobs and green industrial policy I'll talk about. So the World Bank has, or the president of the World Bank has said that jobs are our North Star. The way they've are going to measure that is in terms of growth in the wage bill, so the wage times the number of employees. But we highlight several trade-offs that are apparent in this. One is the trade-off between sort of labor-absorbing industries, like jobs, right, versus skill-intensive industries, or capital-intensive industries. I think I see a lot of, in this conference, I've seen a lot of focus on sort of agribusiness and kind of small-scale stuff. I don't know if that's going to grow wages over generations. Second is just a question of, do you subsidize labor or capital? Even if you're trying to raise wages, subsidizing capital could do that. Finally, there's some work on adjusting on subsidies to help people adjust to trade or technological shifts. I think generally we have the view that broad-based social safety nets are better for this than a particular targeted thing for trade adjustment. On green, I'm running out of time. Okay. Yeah, so we'll talk about green. I think our main point there is just that a lot of people talk about green industrial policy, saying, oh, demand for solar panels is rising, so let's have more solar panels. We want to take a more narrow focused approach, which is to say that if you want to reduce emissions, you're going to have to regulate emissions, and that's costly for firms. And so green industrial policy is about reducing the costs of compliance for firms while reducing emissions. There we go.
Great. So now transitioning into green, Nimrod Zalk from UCT, got to do the proper hosting, is going to talk a bit about.
Yeah, this is not my presentation.
This is not your slide, I know.
No.
Sariv is going to take us a bit into the greening.
Yes.
Nimrod.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, so what I'd like to do is reflect on work that's been done over the last year or so at the Nelson Mandela School, drawing on a couple of publications that we've produced. Starting off with this working paper. It's a product of a group that we convened called the Green Industrial Development Expert Panel. The paper itself was brainstormed, I guess, between Chema and myself, but Chema was the author of this paper. Any difficult questions you can direct to her. I don't want to try and comprehensively discuss this paper or the one that follows, but rather just to draw out a few points. So the first, and hopefully one that will be pretty obvious to everybody, is that structural transformation is absolutely essential to escape poverty rather than what I would say has been in the development community a focus on poverty alleviation, sometimes at the margins, to get from levels of $2 per day to $10, $15 per day that decisively lift people out of poverty. That's what we're talking about when we talk about structural transformation. Second main takeaway is that for most African countries, there obviously are some that are quite fossil fuel intense, but for most African countries, there is now an enormous opportunity to move straight into renewable energy. And in a sense, industrialization in that context will be pretty green, because it will be on the back of a green electrification base. At least in terms of carbon intensity. That's obviously not the only dimension or the only consideration. Third point is that the scope for green industrial policy is much broader than we conventionally think about. I think that for most people, when you think about green industrialization or green industrial policy, one immediately goes to solar panels, electric vehicles, batteries, critical minerals, and so forth. And the argument in this paper is that, in fact, there's a much broader set of relatively low carbon sectors that can form the basis of serious structural transformation, including agricultural modernization on the continent and agribusiness, with the horticulture sector a particular area of opportunity, labor-intensive and medium technology manufacturing, careful strategies for not just adding value to, but in some cases capturing value from critical minerals and transferring some of those rents towards other sectors that have good developmental prospects. It also includes introducing and emphasizing green and circular production processes. And this is not exhaustive, I think this indicative set of sectors. Second last point is that to do this requires some decisive interventions in the financial space. I can't see how this can be done at scale at interest rates that we've heard about yesterday in the order of 20 to 30%. So there has to be serious resource mobilization, and I would be inclined to argue, again, based on a paper that we're launching next week on African development banks, that at the end of the day, it's got to be about domestic and regional resource mobilization. Trade is extremely important. I would argue for balance between what can be done and what can be promoted within the continent, and without losing sight of the opportunities to export to the rest of the world, particularly high income and high growth markets. This is a bit of a busy slide, and it's going to get busier. But this comes from a piece of work on South African industrial policy, and essentially, just to get the gist of it, the vertical axis from bottom to top shows the carbon intensity of industries, with most carbon intensive being at the bottom and least carbon intensive being at the top. And on the horizontal axis, again, rising from low labor intensity on the left to high labor intensity on the right. So basically, a lot of the sectors that we really are interested in are these ones here in the top right quadrant, the quarter one, or quadrant one. Now, if we look at what's happened in terms of South African manufacturing employment and the orientation of industrial policy, a lot of industrial policy has been focused on sectors that are in distress, sectors that have lost jobs over the decade 2013 to 2023. And those are fall into a couple of categories. They both jobs have been lost in the labor-intensive, low or some labor-intensive, low-carbon sectors, but also in the capital-intensive carbon-intensive sectors. So prime examples of the former are, of the latter are steel and structural metal products. To a less extent, steel, heavy industry, carbon-intensive, structural metal products, actually quite labor-intensive, and textiles and apparel. Those are some of the major sectors in which jobs have been declining. However, there are a number of sectors that are, in general, relatively low carbon intensity and also relatively high labor intensity. And I think this is a lot more encouraging. And my key takeaway from this discussion or this session is that when we talk about green industrial policy, we need to be talking about these relatively low carbon, ideally relatively high labor intensity sectors like agro-processing, like machinery and equipment, and again, not included in this data set, the horticulture sector, which actually has been by far the largest job creator over this period. Let me leave it, just a couple of concluding points. Yeah, 2 seconds, okay. So really just to reiterate, green industrial policy is really about a much broader view than solar panels, electric vehicles, that if we're concerned about development and growth. We need to be focusing on sectors that have a combination of both demand-side dynamism and supply-side dynamism. Demand is growing rapidly, ideally tapping into export demand growth, supply-side dynamism, scope for productivity upgrading. And we have to lower the cost of capital if we are to achieve investment at scale in renewable energy and in industrialization on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Nimrod.
And sorry, these are links to 2 of the 3 papers, but the 3rd one I can share on development banks should anybody just
Can we put those back up so people can take a picture, please? If sometime during, I don't know who I'm talking to. Yeah, we'll make sure there's a way to get those links. Great. Zainab Usman from the Center for Global Energy Policy. Zainab, can I turn to you for some thoughts on this? But also, you've been involved in a lot of policy discussions around this. So now we're going to switch gears and get some the practice against the theory.
Practice, I don't know about that. But hello, everyone. Thanks a lot, Tristan, Nimrod. I was told no slides, and I'm usually very obsessed with slides. So now I'm, wondering why I didn't defy that guideline rather than conform to it. I don't know if people get the joke. It's a very bad joke. Like, how South Korea defied its comparative advantage to invest in shipbuilding, becoming the world's largest shipbuilder before it was overtaken by China. Okay, bad joke. Nobody got that. But
Moderator.
Yeah, anyways. Yeah, so I'm going to do 2 things. I'll share some reflections on what we heard from Tristan, the report from the World Bank's Research Department, choosing my words very carefully here. And then I will outline a couple of questions that I would argue will shape industrial policy, particularly around green industrialization, green value chains for the world's 75 low and lower middle income countries. 21 of these low income countries are in Africa. Starting with the report, I think it's timely. It's a great contribution to a growing body of work that has brought industrial policy back to the center of economic planning and development strategy. I particularly like the 15 policy instruments that have been identified and the kind of taxonomy around them. They're likely to be very useful to a lot of countries to policymakers who have been asking questions to World Bank country economists, like we want to do industrial policy, we have problem X, what solution could work to address that problem? And I think it's quite commendable that the bank, the bank's research department is acknowledging the limits of earlier approaches that were very skeptical of state intervention. At the same time, I think it's worth situating this report within a longer intellectual and policy tradition and trajectory, because the resurgence of industrial policy in mainstream policy discourse has been shaped by decades of work by academics. Some of them are in this room. I don't know if Lindsay Whitfield is here. She has a fantastic book on industrial policy in Africa. I just got back from New Delhi. I was there for another conference on industrial policy, and people like Justin Yifulin, Arkebe Okube, who have written, between the two of them, the books that I know of, like 15 books on industrial policy, right, over the past 2 decades. Multilateral institutions, whether it's UNIDO or UNCTAD, among several others. And then, of course, the countries that have just decided to pursue industrial policies on their own, including Morocco. But this is still very good overall. Maybe the final thing I'll say about the report is that I would really like us to push the conversation a little bit further, especially on the question of whether there is a right way of doing industrial policy. As we've heard even from our conversations yesterday, successful industrial policy is very context-specific. It is shaped by countries' starting conditions, whether it's their factor endowments, natural resources, population, geographical location, but also very fundamentally a country's history and its sense of self. We talk so much about Ethiopia. One thing I know about Ethiopia from my friends, from policy discussions I've had, is the strong sense of history, like we're 1,000-plus-year-old civilization, and there are certain things we want to accomplish. Those kinds of ideas about a country's identity shape its ability and its willingness and its approach to pursuing industrial policy. So I think we need to be careful about thinking about the right way of doing things, because then we risk going back to standardized policy prescriptions, which, as we all know, have had very complicated records, to say the least. Now, beyond the report itself, I want to talk about the global context within which industrial policy is being pursued today, because that context has changed so much. And because of that, there are critical questions around the feasibility and viability of industrial policies, even if countries want to pursue them, right? So what is this global context? We are seeing geoeconomic and geopolitical shifts that are shaping industrial policy, but that are also that are affected by the pursuit of industrial policies elsewhere. So first is, during COVID, there were supply chain disruptions. Remember, we're all hunting for masks and gloves and then ventilators and essential pharmaceuticals, which then caused a lot of countries to start thinking, hey, there are certain strategic industries for which we cannot just rely on just-in-time production. We actually need redundancies, even if there are inefficiencies, right? And this goes to Tristan's point. He mentioned earlier around efficiency and effectiveness. That's the whole point, that there are strategic industries where, you absolutely need redundancies, even if there are massive wastages and inefficiencies. So the second geopolitical shift, geoeconomic shift, is the energy transition that is necessary for climate action. The realization that to be able to build competitiveness and retain competitiveness in the new industries, renewable energy, electric mobility, battery storage, and so on and so forth, you do need state intervention, right? I remember Bloomberg did this report I think it might have been a year ago, where they listed about 20 industries of the 21st century, and they compared the US and China. And literally within I think it was 5 years, so they compared 3 time periods, 2005, 2015, and 2025. And within those time periods, China had made so much progress that it had dominance and dominant market share across maybe 12 of the 20 industries, right? So the realization that to build competitiveness and retain competitiveness, you do need state intervention is another factor. And then finally, this is something that tends to be missing even in some of the historical industrial policy literature, the national security imperative for pursuing industrial policy. You know, at the end of the day, we tend to romanticize industrialization because we think about the outcomes, we think about the jobs, the positive spillovers. But industrialization is hard. You know, getting people, pardon my language here, getting rural folk out of their farmlands into factories can be a very violent process of dislocation. Getting women into the labor force is fraught with social tensions. Then the massive environmental damage that comes from, if you've lived close to a factory before, you know, the waste and everything. These things are very ugly and they're very difficult. And on a normal day, most governments don't want to do them. There's often a very strong national imperative to pursue these difficult policies. And the world we live in today with conflict, I think, is an important imperative for a lot of countries to think about rearming. We're seeing countries rearm. We're seeing more considerations around building capabilities in defense industries. So then coming to the questions that I would argue would shape the or would inform the feasibility and viability of industrial policies, even if every other condition is in place, and there are 4. I don't have time to go into all of the 4. I'll list them, and I'll talk about 1 or 2 of them. So the 4 questions are around coordination, around finance, around market access, and around credible commitments. So let me quickly talk about coordination and finance. So with respect to coordination, the key question is, at what level should industrial policy be designed and implemented? Is it national or should it be regional? And can industrial policy be effectively coordinated across countries to achieve sectoral scale? And let me explain a little bit here. Historically, industrial policy has been designed and implemented nationally. But many low and middle income countries, particularly in Africa, face structural constraints that we all know of. Small domestic markets, low income levels, limited skilled labor pools, and geographically dispersed populations. So, you know, Namibia, Botswana, and even outside Africa, Guyana, these are the most scarce, population-scarce countries in the world. You know, 4 people per 10 square kilometers. But in Africa, this question around regional versus national coordination is particularly relevant for mineral value chains, where nearly every African resource-rich country wants to capture the midstream segment of the mining value chain, that's refining, processing, smelting. But this may not be viable at the level of individual countries. You know, I don't know if Ghana can build all of its own smelters on its own, and then, you know, Togo and Niger and Benin, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So that requires regional coordination around shared infrastructure, industrial corridors, and transnational skills and labor mobility policies. Sure, we know what is needed, and if you attend any discussion on the AFCFTA, you're going to hear that we need regional value chains, but where has that worked? What examples do we have? So this is a question.
NAFTA.
Yeah, I mean, NAFTA is a trade agreement. I don't know if regional, I would put that as, yeah, we can discuss that. So maybe NAFTA to an extent, a limited extent. But even in Africa, I think the Southern Africa Customs Union is quite interesting on that front, right? With the common external tariff and then the revenue sharing mechanisms. And then the European Union's common agriculture policies, right? So those are some examples. But I think the point here is that it's going to be very hard and very difficult. But this is what is needed. Then on finance, very quickly, and this is the last point, How will industrial policy be financed in context of constrained fiscal capacity? And can external finance substitute for domestic resources? And would this dynamic inadvertently seed the policy setting agenda and allocative decisions to external stakeholders? Let me explain a little bit here. Again, historically, the East Asian example was underpinned by high domestic savings rates, right, that financed infrastructure, public goods, and generous subsidies and investments. But we know that a lot of low and middle income countries, particularly in Africa, have low savings, low domestic revenue mobilization, but also high levels of sovereign debt, right? But at the same time, there is external, significant levels of external public finance, whether it's the ODA, Official Development Assistance. It is declining, but on average, it's at $230 billion a year. Of course, when you disaggregate it, like 60% of it goes to like social sectors, humanitarian aid. But if we are to succeed in convincing donors to prioritize supporting industrial policy, and then another $11 billion coming from philanthropies, you know, the Gates Foundation, Ford, Rockefeller, and all of those, there's still another question, which is, suddenly you have these entities with financial muscle, devoting resources. Would that affect allocative, would that give them allocative power? And would that seed decision making to these external entities? Where has that worked before? So this is a very, very valid question. And I think Mission 300 is probably an interesting case study, right, to track on this front. So those are two questions. There are two others. There's no time. Maybe during the conversation, I can try to talk about market access, because I think it's very, very critical, and then credible commitments.
Thank you. Thank you, Zainab. Okay, last but not least, and then I'm going to open up for the audience for your questions and your brief comments. But last but not least, I want to turn to Mugo Kabati. Mugo's with Telecom Kenya, but has actual experience in designing industrial policy. So, Mugo.
Last but not least, that's ominous. First of all, thank you. I'm glad I'm coming after Zainab, because she's framed it. I'm going to use her frame. I don't attend very many conferences, and when I was invited here, I was told, you know, you're going to give the practical approach, the real world approach. I think it was to reassure me that in this gathering of intellectuals and academics and researchers, I still have something to contribute. First, using your frame, I'll react to Tristan and Nimrod. And just to say, industrial policy and market driven versus government driven. I'm not sure what that means, to be quite honest. In 2006, the late President Mwai Kibaki directed that we begin to formulate a transformational national development plan for Kenya, which eventually became Kenya Vision 2030. And Mwai Kibaki was an economist by training, had been finance minister for 11 years, 69 to 81, was vastly experienced with all this stuff you get, multilateral institutions, the World Bank, IMF, you name it. And he expressly gave the instruction that it was to be a Kenya-only plan at development stage. Expressly instructed that we exclude any foreign participation in the development of that plan. Now, he had his reasons, we didn't. Well, I was very young then. And that's exactly what happened. And now I understand why, because you're telling me that you decided 30, 40 years ago market-driven was the way to go. The World Bank. The World Bank decided, and now the World Bank has decided, no, government intervention is necessary. And I'm like, we've been doing government intervention all through. I mean, I have no idea. This is completely, I'll have to read that report and understand it. But I can tell you we've been doing government intervention very seriously because that's what Vision 2030 Development Plan was. We chose 6 economic sectors to focus on in the economic pillar of Vision 2030. We identified areas, of infrastructure development that were crucial to buttressing the 6 economic sectors. We identified macroeconomic stability and public sector reforms, including performance-based management of the public sector. All that was in this Vision 2030, of which I was privileged to be the first chief executive of and director general in Kenya, and under the second term of we launched it in the second term of President Kibaki, and the coordination of private sectors and government engagement of private sector, and focusing on the 6 sectors that we had identified was my job, ensuring that infrastructure development, whether it was energy or roads or, especially roads and energy, to a lesser extent airports and ports, were along the lines of our engagement with private sector and what they told us or what they said were priorities. But government also had very strong views of priority sectors, especially given what Zainab talked about, the fact that we do have a significant part of African populations, Kenya being no exception, which are in, rural. I would even go even beyond rural, because when you think about rural, you think about some farmland with, countryside farmland. I'm talking about the areas of the country which are just a few centuries post hunter-gatherer. The spectrum of the citizenry in a country like Kenya, and I think it's true for many African countries, is very broad. In one of my roles, I was founding chairman of Lake Turkana wind power plant, which was a large wind power plant that we built in a remote part of northern Kenya. And northern Kenya is the area that has been most underdeveloped in Kenya for many years. In fact, the LAPSET project, those of you who've heard about it, the Lamu Port South Sudan Ethiopia Transport Corridor, which is part of Vision 2030, was geared towards transforming northern Kenya and mainstreaming it into the economy. And after I left Vision 2030, I took the job of chairmanship of Lake Turkana Wind Power Construction. And I recall the first time we had end of month payment of salaries. And I was based in Nairobi. I was called in Nairobi by the CEO, and he told me we're having a near riot here. And I asked him what's going on, and he said, we are being accused of shortchanging the workers here. And that was because they had never seen payslips in their entire life. They had no idea what taxes were or statutory pension deductions. They thought they were being cheated by management. What am I saying? It was the first formal entity or institution of its kind in that part of the country. So these are the countries we're talking about. When you talk about Africa, it's not just Nairobi. Kenya is not just Nairobi. Tanzania is not Dar es Salaam. Ethiopia is not Addis. It is very diverse, broad spectrum of citizenry. And so Vision 2030, as we developed it, had to encompass all that. And so I am gratified to see that, the World Bank has caught up, and I think now we're aligned. We're very aligned. But I think also, when you're talking about low-income countries and lower middle-income countries, but especially low-income countries, and I was in government when we transitioned from a low-income to a lower middle-income country, then the needs, the developmental needs are so fundamental and so basic that really it's academic to talk about government intervention planning or not. You need roads. I mean, the infrastructure needs, for instance, are so basic. There are areas that have absolutely no roads, no rail, no airports, no way of getting farm produce to markets, or getting raw materials to the factories that need them, that you cannot talk, you do have to have government planning and order and prioritization. And also because the revenues are so limited, tax revenues are so limited, both because the economy, GDP is low, but also because of the organization of the economy to have proper tax collection is such that you do have to have government planning. So that's my reaction. And when it comes to green, Kenya, by the way, has by default, I would say, pretty significant green energy grid because of our geothermal energy, wind energy, if I dare say so myself. But we find ourselves often trapped developmentally by this 80%. We're proud of saying 80% of Kenya's grid is green. It's hydro, wind, and geothermal. But we need to grow, for industrial transformation and development, we need to grow that energy capacity significantly, that this 80% becomes a trap, frankly speaking. And we see people in other parts of the world that are growing in leaps and in leaps and bounds, and they're not necessarily completely green today, even though everyone is going towards green. Let me also make a couple of comments on what I want to talk about in terms of the context we are in today, the global context we are in today. January 20th, last year, a series of executive orders were issued from a big Casablanca. And these executive orders, by and large, essentially changed the world order, especially in terms of the relationship between developing countries such as Africa and the US and the priorities of the US, and made it very clear that it was time, not just for Africa actually, but for the whole world to start taking care of itself. I don't want to say anything fast, but it was like, let me just put it, you're on your own without us, because it is us first. And there was a flurry of activity, and I know that yesterday when I raised the question I raised, I was told in uncertain terms that the Europeans are not doing that well. And I'm not suggesting they are, but at least they were making attempts and efforts to do something about it, to react to this new, what I call the post-Trumpian world. And China, Russia, India, suddenly began having, tripartite summits. Yet about a month after this, in February of 2025, the African Union met in Addis Ababa. And the theme for the AU summit in Addis Ababa, where we had all our African heads of state, a month after this change in the world order, was justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. That was the theme of the AU summit in February of 2025. This year, slight improvement, assuring sustainable water availability and safe sanitation systems to achieve the goals of Agenda 2063. Now, those are important things. I'm not sure about the reparations, but I think water sanitation is important. But the point is, and the question is, Africa countries can ill, we cannot afford to be bilaterally negotiating with a very weak hand. In a new world where might makes right is back, we are back to 1944, in my view. I think 1945 was a special year where the victorious powers decided that the new world order should include those who have been conquered and they should be supported, you know, and Germany was rebuilt and Japan was rebuilt by the conquering nations, which is unusual if you look at past World War victories. And now suddenly we're in a world where might makes right, where Ukraine is told, you know, give us half your minerals and we'll support you against the invader. Or the DRC, you know, has negotiations where we're going to broker peace, and it's the reality that Africa must wake up to, and Kenya can't do it alone. I don't think Ethiopia can do it alone. I don't think anyone can do it alone. I think it's important that Africa gets together and addresses the fact that we need to collectively negotiate, collaborate more. If at COVID, you know, Africans were forced by COVID to come together and actually have a solution that has been difficult to achieve before. Then we went back to BAU thereafter, where in East Africa we've had plans to build a rail from Mombasa all the way to Kampala to Rwanda, have a pipeline, build refineries that support the whole region. But Kenya and Uganda are always arguing about who should own the refinery. And guilty as charged. But we cannot afford to be individual actors in this new world order, where Mark Carney has clearly indicated that some of us are at the table and some of us are at the menu. Guess who is on the menu? If we don't get our act together, I feel strongly that we have to review that. President Museveni of Uganda, famously, he tells a joke quite often, which is a very sharp joke, where he says, at the time when Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania were the only members of this African community, he says, we're always arguing who is better than the other. It's like three pygmies arguing who is 1 inch taller. That is taken from President Museveni. And I think we need to take him very seriously. So that is one, and I know that I'm getting the hook. So just to finish, the post-Trumpian era, that's one. But also, there are opportunities. The current US-Iran conflict, we should not walk on anybody's grave. I think it's a very serious issue. But I think for East Africa, for instance, in terms of alternative logistics routes, this is a time to look at that kind of thing. But we can't do it just as Kenya. But, you know, alternative sources of fuel. Nigeria, West Africa has a great opportunity in my view. Ethiopian Airlines, tremendous opportunity. I think there are many opportunities that actually, if we step back as a continent to review, we would find. And finally, technology is a third main thing, and AI is a threat. Labor replacement, we're hoping for BPOs to come to Africa and all that stuff. That may be taken over by AI. But we can also do some leapfrogging, like we did 20 years ago with mobile telephony and mobile financial services like M-Pesa, using AI. There are tremendous opportunities for African countries to be able to leapfrog on AI. So it's either a threat or an opportunity, depending on the stance we take and how organized we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mugo. Questions? You've been very patient. Let's start with Yemi and Zaid, and then we'll move over here. Let's take 4, and then I'm hoping we can get another round in. I'll try and keep the panel there.
Thank you very much. I want to return the favor to Tristan. But seriously, I first of all welcome the fact that the World Bank is even mentioning the word industrial policy, or World Bank Research Department. But I just wanted to ask, to what extent can you talk about industrial policy in the context of a list of policies? I think it's that coordination, that interoperability of things that helps make industrial policy. So just having a technocratic list of policies may not cut it, but I haven't read the report, so I just thought I should ask to what extent you thought that would work. And then to Mugo, I'm not holding a brief for the African Union, but first of all, to explain that those themes are fixed 1 year ahead, and there's very little room for the Secretariat to maneuver. And secondly, you will be happy to know that your president is in charge of the process of helping the AU through these things. Thank you.
Thank you. Mine is perhaps directed to Zainab. You talked about cooperation as a critical area of focus if we had to achieve industrialization. And at the same time, you seem to cast some aspersions to the capacity of the African regional integration to manage the cooperation, to develop value chains. What would you suggest to be the alternative to value addition, especially in the area of critical minerals, where we have seen bleeding of the continent's value through the export of raw materials?
Thank you. My question is really around, from Tristan actually, when it comes to emission sort of management and the industries. And I'm quite interested to understand, like, how do you sort of balance between free cross-border trade and carbon emissions? Because I think, for instance, from a European point of view, with the new carbon border adjustment mechanism, that is really a trade barrier rather than a climate sort of initiative approach. And I think it is causing quite a lot of trade problems within the European Union. For instance, just to mention, if you were to import an alumina from, let's say, Turkey or India at this stage, if you actually have to account for the carbon price today through the ETS, that's quite expensive. So my question is, how African countries can sort of not go through the same mistake while, you know, implementing carbon emission sort of mitigation mechanisms without going through that process? Thank you.
Yeah, great. I hope that in this report, the World Bank report, apart from the kind of high-level policy direction or suggestions, you delve into some of the how that industrial policy gets implemented, because in many countries, public entities and state-owned enterprises are very, very often the vehicles through which government will build large infrastructure. You know, I worked in South Africa across, you know, the road from Nimrod here. I was in the Ministry of Finance, and there we saw over a very short period of time the fiscal cost of SOE interventions, from having the lowest prices in the world, I mean electricity tariffs, and how that built up massive liabilities in the system. And some of that was to give cheaper electricity to industry. So I think generally I welcome very much this direction, but there's a cautionary note that where you don't have adequate state capacity or capability, and then you start implementing some of these measures without very, very clear kind of cost-benefit analysis and a kind of private sector lens, right? You're going to potentially put governments in a much, much, much worse off situation and end up with big white elephant projects. And that's even in sophisticated environments like South Africa, let alone small economies, you know, which don't have the state capability, don't have robust institutions, and don't have good parliamentary oversight. And so if we say to them, yeah, go for it, start, you know, I think the kind of fiscal costs and risks could be massive.
Let's take one more and then we'll go to the panel.
Bonjour à tout le monde. Je tenais d'abord, bon, je vais parler, m'exprimer en français. Si vous avez la transcription ou la traduction, autant pour moi. C'est bon? Ok, tout d'abord, je tenais à saluer les panélistes sur leurs différentes présentations qu'ils nous ont vraiment délivrées. Je dirais que c'est des présentations de haute facture. J'avais juste 2 questions à vous poser. C'est dans le contexte de la transition verte. Je voulais demander comment nous, les pays africains, nous pourrions simultanément attirer les investissements étrangers, développer des capacités industrielles locales et utiliser la propriété industrielle comme levier pour éviter de rester dépendant des technologies importées. Ça, c'était la première question. La deuxième question, c'est à quoi ressemblerait une chaîne de valeur verte 100% africaine dans 20 ans? Et quels sont les obstacles majeurs à surmonter dès aujourd'hui? Ça, c'est une question ouverte adressée à tout le monde. Je vous remercie.
All right, so the first question is how to bring in green technology in the context of the green transition while leveraging intellectual property to localize the technology and not become dependent on foreigners. Sorry, I translate a bit approximately because I'm not an official translator. And then the second part is how in Africa, what are the opportunities to develop fully integrated and yet green value chains? In 20 years. In 20 years.
Great. Okay, let me turn to the panel. Who would like to go first? I'm not going to pick on you. Zainab?
The question on regional value chains for minerals, I mean, it's actually fascinating. Before I address the question, you know, when you look at the kind of resurgence of industrial policy, particularly in advanced economies, so much of that is happening around critical minerals, actually. Right? The US is pursuing an industrial policy, and it's now internationalizing that industrial policy. So, so much happening in that space regarding this conversation. But to the specific question around cooperation, regional coordination, right? So I have so many thoughts on this, and there's a lot of work I've done in this area, and I'm trying to be as unemotional about it because I also get frustrated. I do think there are things that are very doable, but they are not being done. So to begin with, there needs to be, you know, there are low-hanging fruits that I would argue that the African Union and Pan-African organizations can pluck or seize upon, right? So when you talk to a lot of investors in the industry, the first thing they will tell you is there just isn't even enough geological survey data on the mineral endowments in a lot of African countries. Not every country. I mean, South Africa, Nigeria has conducted recent surveys. Tanzania, too, is working with South Korea on this front. But there just isn't enough data and information. So when you hear people cite numbers like Africa has 30% of the world's critical minerals, where are they getting that information from? You know, I don't know where they're pulling those numbers from. There's an entity called the African Minerals Development Center, right? This is meant to be the African Union's technical agency in charge of minerals, not just critical minerals, but also precious metals, gemstones. It's meant to be underpinned by the African Mining Vision. But here's the thing. The African Minerals Development Center, there's a reason why most of you have not heard of it, because it's not yet a fully fledged entity. Why isn't it a fully fledged technical agency of the African Union? Because it needs ratifications from at least 14 member states of the African Union. They've not ratified it. You know, the former interim director of the AMDC spent years going around the African continent trying to get countries to ratify the statute. They've not done it. Unless they ratify the statute, the AMDC is not going to have the mandate and the resources to do what it needs to do to play an important coordination role around even something as basic as, you know, guiding member states to conduct surveys and to have harmonized data so that they can attract investments and do so many other things. That's just one small example of something that can be done, but it's not being done. Before you get to, oh, let's build regional value chains, try and get the data first so that you can attract investors, right? So that's on regional value chains. But just very quickly on CBAM, I know the question was not addressed to me, but I think it speaks to the broader question around market access. So a lot of the work I do on trade looks at the US, Africa, and US and other low and middle income countries. And across the board, there's a trend of, the increasing difficulty in accessing high income markets for countries that have not industrialized and countries that want to pursue export-oriented industrialization. Now, oftentimes people would argue that, well, African countries can just focus on domestic and regional markets. True, for certain kinds of exports. But we know from the literature, from research, the work of someone like Eric Verhoeven, for example, shows that industrial upgrading tends to happen better, faster, and in a much qualitative sense when firms can export and sell to rich customers, right? You have to produce things at a higher quality, you have to kind of abide by certain kinds of standards, then you become more competitive. There's so many reasons for you to have access to high income markets. But that is now very uncertain. A preferential trade program like the Generalized System of Preferences, which gave duty-free access to around 120 countries, expired in 2020 and has not been reauthorized. The African Growth and Opportunity Act expired last year, has barely been authorized for a year. It probably will expire again. So across the board, there's that trend. And then, of course, you have CBAM in Europe, which, as you argue, and I agree absolutely, constitutes some kind of trade restriction. So this is a valid question for countries that have not industrialized. If you cannot access high-income country markets, there are real questions around your ability to experience industrial upgrading. So, stop there.
Excellent.
Maybe the green
thank
value
you.
chains question?
Who else would?
No?
No?
Okay.
You're good? Okay, let's do 1.5 minutes each so that we can...
Yeah, let me take a couple of the questions.
Yeah,
so first, on the how, there's a lot in the report about how. You can read all about state-owned enterprises. On the order, so we do have a framework which says that it's 4 I's. So you start with institutions, which include, the functioning of the government, but also economy-wide fundamentals like infrastructure, education, and so forth. Then you move to these public inputs with like the industrial parks and market access assistance, which are cheap to provide and also are first choice in the sense that they directly address market failures. Then you move to the market incentives, and then finally the which are costly for either for the economy or for your fiscal, and then the macro things, which are, I think, uncertain in their impacts. I'll say, I'm glad you spoke about Kenya, because I think they're actually, and the process you described is pretty close to the market fundamentals approach of the 90s, in the sense that, you have this industrialization strategy, you look at 6 sectors, but then the policy implications are, let's have good roads, let's have infrastructure. This isn't industry targeted or tailored stuff. If you look at Kenya's fiscal, they actually have very low firm subsidies. Most of the firm subsidies and tax exemptions are on the VAT, kind of for consumers. So Kenya is I think, following the market-friendly approach, and maybe I think even could benefit from taking a few strategic bets on high-risk other industries and so forth. I think, let me see, on green, I mean, the point of CBAM is that the European Union decided to highly regulate carbon emissions in its economy, and you have to do that to reduce emissions, but it's also going to harm your firms. You can't, have your lunch and eat it too as much as, or cake and eat it too. And so I think if Africa wants to regulate carbon emissions, it will probably have to do something similar. Otherwise, you'll lose competitiveness. So I think that it's sort of, there's a fundamental thing with reducing emissions that it's going to be costly for the firms that are high emissions, and you need to deal with it. Just maybe to move to the green, I think I want to highlight that what you mentioned, Nimrod, on the green, those are all opportunities and sort of new growth, but they're not necessarily going to reduce emissions unless firms change their incentives to adopt them and so forth. So I think it's just important to make that.
Most African countries, they're on. For most
No,
African
exactly,
countries,
exactly.
don't have
yeah.
high emissions. So
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
No. So yes, I agree. It's just.
Something. I know it wasn't addressed at me. Sorry, I'm being, But the question on how, with all due respect, why would you be looking at? And I'm not trying to attack the World Bank. I used to work there. Still a very important institution that we need. But why would you look to the World Bank to tell you how to do industrial policy? The research department just decided that now it wants to legitimize industrial policy. I mean, no, seriously, like why?
That's not what I said. I said we.
No, but it's, you just decided now, you're just waking up from sleep. If you want to look at how state-owned enterprises can function effectively, get your country to send a study mission to some country that has figured it out.
How about Singapore, which we have a case study about? You can read all about it.
Again, I just came back from New Delhi, and there was in my hotel, there were people who thought I was from Kenya, part of a Kenyan delegation that was there on a study trip. That is the path forward. Just cut the middleman and go and find information based on evidence on what has worked. I mean, we're being very polite here, but there are a lot of things about that report that we disagree with. Right? And, Tristan, you're going to do your book tour, and you will get that feedback from a lot of people. Trust me.
All right.
I'm just being nice here.
Now that the gloves are off, let us go to coffee. We can continue the conversation downstairs. Thank you all to all the panelists.